Georg Wilhelm von Friedrich Hegel has acquired quite the reputation since he first made his appearance in the history of Western philosophy. He's one of the most influential minds ever to grace the Western canon, and was celebrated as a kind of genius even in his own time, seen as the great innovator of German philosophy, carrying forward the project begun by Kant. And yet, at the same time, he's known as one of the most difficult philosophers to read. He has a reputation as well for using language that is complex and at times tortured. And for all his fame, his ideas are not widely understood. Popular myths and oversimplified explanations of Hegel abound, much of which has little to do with what he actually wrote. The situation is even further complicated by the fact that much of what we have from Hegel is in the form of lecture notes, which has been translated and compiled into book form. Hegel, like many other philosophers such as Nietzsche or Wittgenstein, also rethought his project during his life, meaning that there's an early and later period of Hegel's thought. And so the first disclaimer for this episode is that it's not going to be a comprehensive explanation of Hegel, nor am I qualified to give such an explanation. We're going to talk about something very specific in Hegel that is relevant to the work of Nietzsche and will be particularly relevant to Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche. Hegel was born in 1770 in the Kingdom of Prussia, then still part of the Holy Roman Empire. His father was a secretary in the court of the Duke. When he was 18 years old, Hegel attended the Protestant seminary attached to the University of Tübingen, though he likely never had any intention of becoming a minister himself. There, he met the poet Hölderlin and the philosopher Schelling, and the three became close friends, and together became Hellenists, fans of Hellenic literature and philosophy. In spite of his fascination with the Greeks, Hegel was a devout Christian, and much of his philosophy can be seen as religious in its inspiration. Interpreters have found this in the alleged Trinitarian aspects of his thought, or the fact that his philosophy centers around the redemption of appearance, and thus the interpretation of Christianity as a religion where God appears on earth in the flesh, as the most significant aspect of Christianity. Hegel's views on Christianity can be seen as apropos to the time in which he lived. This was the transition to the period of Romanticism, the movement in philosophy which seeks to redeem what was formerly called mere appearance, and the emphasis on sentimentality, on emotion, feeling, and experience. It was not long after the time of Rousseau, Hume, and Kant that Hegel lived. And as the philosophy of Immanuel Kant reshaped the intellectual landscape of Europe, Hegel was destined to engage with this philosophy. The thing in itself versus mere appearance dichotomy that Kant has written of is something Hegel directly responds to in his own work. Hegel had a long and fairly successful career at the university, teaching at Jena, at Nuremberg, at Heidelberg, while bearing witness to the invasion of Napoleon, and also intersecting with the lives of countless other historical figures. Hegel died in 1831 at 61 years old after a period of bad health, and then there was a cholera epidemic that came through. Although it's possible he died of a gastrointestinal disease, I was reading. He's buried next to the philosopher Fichte, according to Hegel's wishes, and his two surviving sons took the care of his letters and papers. As mentioned, he achieved notoriety during his lifetime, but his posthumous reputation would only grow until Hegel came to be seen as the herald of the historical turn in Western philosophy, meaning that truth itself is no longer viewed as an unchanging, eternal, or abstract construction, something timeless to which certain statements or actions might attempt to approximate or correspond, but rather truth is something dynamic, something which is not timeless, but revealed in the temporal lives of human beings, something which had to come into being, so to speak, something which evolves, changes, and develops. Hegel's philosophy, and particularly his philosophy of history, can be seen alongside the scientific work of Darwin, for example, and seeing man as a historical animal rather than one which was created ex nihilo. an animal that comes into being over the course of a long history. Fascinating as this idea may be, Hegel's method for arguing this idea, it's challenging even for veteran readers of philosophy. The complexity of Hegel seems to border on insanity at times. That observation was even made during his own lifetime. Goethe's wife remarked after having encountered Hegel at a dinner party that she couldn't decide whether he was the most brilliant mind she'd ever encountered or a raving madman. The general opinion on Hegel has probably not changed very much since that time, with most of the non-philosophical community, and even much of the philosophical community, likely to dismiss many of the major passages in Hegel as incomprehensible, especially if you just pluck them out of context and read them. I remember a podcast, for example, where I think it was Eric Weinstein interviewed the philosopher Agnes Collard, and he quoted a passage from Hegel and said that upon reading it aloud, quote, "I sound insane to myself," end quote. Furthermore, Hegel, like Nietzsche, often can't escape from the political ideologies that have been influenced by his work. Those who wish to claim Hegel for their side or tar and feather Hegel as the evil man who influenced and helped create that other evil ideology, right? In Hegel's case, the Hegelian dialectic, one of Hegel's methods, the other being phenomenology, is eventually adopted by Karl Marx, who takes Hegel's idealism and makes it material. Whereas Hegel exists within the milieu of German idealist philosophers, including also Kant, Fichte, Schopenhauer, to some extent Nietzsche, although definitely not later Nietzsche. You could say Nietzsche is in dialogue with these people, right? You could say that he is a response. You almost need to understand German idealism to fully understand Nietzsche, even if he's not, properly speaking, a German idealist. But Marx is a materialist and considers his own philosophy to be dialectical materialism, rather than Hegel's dialectic, which is a revelation of self-consciousness in history with religious implications for this. Marx takes the ideal and completely shifts our focus to the material world, such that the dialectic in Hegel is a sort of realization of the communion of God and man, a true kingdom of heaven revealed on earth, whereas Marx is aimed at a concrete historical development, driven by material forces rather than by mind. This clear line of influence, however, from Hegel to Marx, means that whatever one thinks of Marx, Hegel is sometimes saddled with the ultimate responsibility for him. That kind of prejudgment probably makes it all the more difficult to perceive the real Hegel. Because, supposing, for example, that you're a Marxist, you're likely to consider Hegel as this valuable philosopher, a step in the direction of Marxism, even though among Marxists, just as among just the general population, you're likely not to have even read Hegel, and even less likely to have understood him, which leaves you dependent on other people to read Hegel and interpret him for you, probably according to whatever lens that interpreter views the world through. And on the other side of that coin, the staunch anti-communist might see Hegel's, infamous incomprehensibility as evidence of the insanity of his ideology and, not even bother to read Hegel at all. And similarly, we'll get his interpretations of Hegel from those who are hostile towards him. Neither one of these approaches is a very good method for understanding Hegel in his own time, in his own place, in terms of his own project. Now, when it comes to Friedrich Nietzsche, the subject of our podcast, he didn't often mention Hegel in his published work. But nevertheless, he did write in his notes about Hegel, and usually from a critical or oppositional standpoint. Famously, Gilles Deleuze, a later philosopher and interpreter of Nietzsche, argues that Nietzsche's opposition to Hegel is laced throughout Nietzsche's entire project, and that this constitutes a sort of silent hostility, just as Nietzsche's hostility to Christianity in his first book, Birth of Tragedy, is largely unarticulated, but nevertheless implicit in much of what he argues. Nietzsche does not, in other words, openly declare his project as anti-Hegelian and define himself conceptually in relation to Hegel, but nevertheless operates from premises which are, in many respects, antithetical to those of Hegel. Much of Nietzsche's own historical analysis can be read as a refutation of Hegel's own assertions when it comes to history, and the historical origins and development of consciousness and morality. Whereas Hegel writes of history as a process driving towards an end, with something with a goal contained within, Nietzsche's view of history is cyclical, that of the eternal recurrence, and it is amoral. Hegel's philosophy is inevitably social and relational. It's a system in which negation establishes existence, where everything is defined in relation to everything else, and on this basis do we say that something exists. Whereas Deleuze asserts Nietzsche's own approach is based on affirmative difference, individual, unrelated, peculiar things or forces, a multiplicity of forces, asserting themselves from their own perspective against the others. Nietzsche's forces do not relate to one another dialectically. They are truly different. This disagreement between the method of Nietzsche and the method of Hegel is another factor that can bias a Nietzschean in their reading of Hegel. And since that kind of prejudice will likely characterize my own audience, I thought the best thing to do would be to make my own attempt at explaining the Hegelian dialectic, and to do this concretely through the Master and Slave Dialectic. I wanted to do this because we're getting into Deleuze next week, and since part of the way that Deleuze explains Nietzsche is as this opposition toward Hegel, or the anti-Hegel in some ways, I think it's important to understand what Hegel is in order for that to be explanatory. Before we get polemical with Deleuze's critiques of Hegel, using Nietzsche in many ways as a weapon for that purpose, I want to get into the weeds of this topic and clear away some of those weeds, some of the murk, hopefully create a bit more clarity for all of us who only have a cursory familiarity with Hegel, or perhaps no familiarity at all. That way, even if you eventually end up, satisfied with calling Hegel insane, we can at least say that we did the work to present as clear of a case as possible for Hegel's perspective. And part of why I chose the Master-Slave Dialectic as the concrete subject of the episode, because not only is it exceedingly helpful to have a specific example of the dialectic, but it also because Nietzsche's master and slave morality, outlined in Beyond Good and Evil and Genealogy of Morals, can be seen in some ways as a response to Hegel's dialectic on this point. It's Nietzsche's differing narrative to Hegel, we might say, as to the significance of this social relationship and its effect on shaping morality and consciousness. Before we get to the master and slave dialectic proper, however, we should first consider what the Hegelian dialectic is and how it operates. And in order to do this, we have to say a few words about Hegel's phenomenology. The way I'll attempt to explain this is by first situating Hegel in relation to Kant and the Kantian distinction between thing in itself and the world of appearance, noumena and phenomena. We could say that this type of thinking in Western philosophy dates back to the time of Plato with the theory of the forms. It's picked up by Aristotle with his division into substance and form. And if you'll allow me the poetic license, the quickest way to explain this is to say that the thing in itself is the substance that objects or things have. When you perceive an object in the world, let's say an elephant, you perceive all of these qualities about it. It looks a certain way to you. It's big and gray. Perhaps it has a certain smell. Maybe you hear the sound of the elephant, blowing through his trunk. And every individual receives the perception of these qualities, sight, smell, sound, through their senses. And as we know, the sense perception of a thing might vary from individual to individual. There's the famous story of the blind people all touching the different parts of an elephant and perceiving a different quality of the elephant. But even the premise of that example, that they are blind people, right, shows the ways in which the differences in the sense organs we have affects the way we variously perceive the world. If your sense organ responsible for sight doesn't function at all, then there's no visual aspect to the object. But for sighted people, there is a visual aspect. So is the visual aspect essential to the object? Or is it something the perceiver brings to bear? Or when we talk about the way something appears visually, are we talking about something for which our sense organs are required? In other words, if nobody possessed the faculty of sight, would it even be comprehensible to us to speak of the visual aspects of objects? The idea of the thing in itself is the assertion that there's some essential thingness or substance to whatever is perceived, whether it's an elephant or a tree or another human being or whatever, that is independent of the way the thing is perceived. Plato thought it was a form, the idea of the thing which exists independent of the individual iterations of the thing. Aristotle would say substance or essence. For Kant, importantly, the thing in itself, independent of how we perceive it, is something that philosophy has to acknowledge in order to establish the limits of reason, but we can claim no knowledge of the thing in itself, since it's beyond our perceptions of it by definition. The thing as it is, independent of our perception of it, can never be perceived by definition in some sense. The result of this is, of course, an intractable dualism between an intelligible world that we can't perceive and a world of perception that is regarded as less than real. Hegel's phenomenology attempts to overcome this dualism through the abolition of the thing in itself. And if this sounds somewhat similar to Nietzsche's project, it is, at least in this respect. Both men are influenced by, among others, Heraclitus, and they both at least begin from this type of premise, that the appearance must be reunited with reality in terms of how we think about appearance. This would mean, however, that a thing is no longer a thing in itself. What does it mean not to be a thing in itself? There are many ways you could attempt to answer this question, but Hegel's route is to suggest that the thing is in fact defined by its perception and recognition. One way to explain this is that all properties or qualities of physical things, the grayness of the elephant, the sound that it makes when it blows its trunk, these are qualities that only exist insofar as they are sensations. The qualities themselves are sensations. What Plato did with the theory of the forms is that he abstracted those qualities, we might say adjectives, and made them into nouns. Consider something like grayness, the idea of the color gray, or of being gray, but independent of any gray object. That's the abstraction, moving from the concrete experience of seeing something which is gray and positing the existence of grayness as such. And so, by extension, the entire concept of being in itself is an abstraction. Being is a noun that we've abstracted away, this idea of being, to be, existence, we've cut it off and isolated it from any individual thing that exists. And that's what abstraction is, separating a quality from its individual instantiation, and then therefore making it into a thing, making the quality into a thing. Taking one quality from a thing with many qualities and treating it as equivalent to that quality wherever it appears in other things. So you say the elephant is gray, so is my laptop. They both possess this quality of grayness, which we've abstracted from either of those individual things and can now speak of this quality. And so abstraction is the creation of a thing in itself by representing only, we might say, a single aspect of reality. Hegel's phenomenology, on the contrary, recognizes the perception of a gray object as existing only in the moment in which the gray thing appears. It is, in other words, sensation, and when we've moved beyond sensation into the world of categories or ideas, that always represents the abstraction of that sensation. Qualities could therefore perhaps more accurately be regarded as effects, or as I often talk about, in terms of stimulus. The elephant has no essential quality of grayness. Gray is an effect that the elephant has on the viewer when they visually perceive it. The sound of it blowing air through its trunk is another effect. It's a force. It's a sound wave that hits our eardrums. The sound doesn't exist independently. It exists at the intersection of our eardrums and the wave. And so we might think of that old Zen koan. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? One who rejects the idea of thing in itself says, no, it doesn't make a sound. Because sound is not sound in itself. What would that even be? Sound is not just the wave. It is the wave's effect on a being with a hearing organ. It's defined by its perception or recognition by being. all properties of things exist as effects, as sensations experienced by other forces or beings. And therefore, these qualities don't exist independently, as a thing in itself would. The thing in itself is timeless and outside of the world of phenomenon or beyond it, transcending it. The world of phenomena is inevitably the world of change. And so to establish this idea of the thing in itself, it always has to be changeless and beyond its individual instantiations. But rather, qualities in the Hegelian sense exist dependently. It's the meeting of two forces wherein a perception can take place. The Hegelian dialectic is based on this type of understanding of appearance. Appearance as relationship and phenomena as dependent. The way this comes out in Hegelian logic is that Hegel ends up challenging the age-old dictate of Aristotle that a thing cannot be both itself and something other than itself, or rather, both itself and the negation of itself. And in some sense, the challenge to this idea, the law of non-contradiction, could be seen as Hegel's innovation in philosophy. So Aristotle says that x equals x, and to say that x could also equal the negation of x is inherently illogical. He says it's the most certain of all principles. We sort of accept this logical axiom by brute force. For Hegel, however, one might say that x has to also equal not x, or to put it more forcefully, all being is premised on negation. We define a thing by the process of negation. The argument would be not just within Hegelianism, but that this idea of defining through negation actually exists within the construction of our thought, and Hegel is simply revealing it to us. That when we say it is here, we can only establish that a thing is here by saying that it is not there. It's this color, and thus it's not the other colors. So to say the elephant is gray, we're designating it simultaneously as one thing, but also designating it as not any of the other possibilities. It's not red, it's not blue, it's not green, and so on and so forth. Indeed, exclusion is a necessary premise of inclusion. We draw a boundary line and say, this is what is contained in this concept. That requires that we simultaneously exclude everything that's not contained. It's a rather common sense type of observation, but there's a larger claim that's being made here. By contrasting things, we acquire a notion of what each thing is. That we discover all of the affirmative categories of things, this color, this sound, by encountering lots of different types of sensations and experiences, and thereby recognizing the differences between them, the ways in which they're not the same as one another. And so, one way of putting the Hegelian understanding of negation is that negation both separates and it connects at the same time, by the same token. An easy way of explaining this might be with the designation of place, of a location. There's no way to give directions to someone without making reference to other places or locations. I know, obviously, that everyone just uses GPS now, but let's say that you don't have your phone and you have to actually get directions from somebody. There's no way for them to give you those directions without referencing places other than the target location that you're trying to get to. If you say, go down that road, it's the third street after the light, you're directing the person to the target street by differentiating it from the other two streets after the light. It's not the first, it's not the second. And you're differentiating it from all the streets you pass before the light. It's not any of those. Furthermore, the more complicated the directions, or the more specific that you have to be, the more such negations have to be utilized. Oh, it's the house on the right with a red pickup truck in the driveway. To say it's on the right-hand side is a description which is entirely dependent on the existence of the left-hand side. It would make no sense if there was only one side of the street with houses on it, and all the houses on the right-hand side. You couldn't then narrow in your directions of where you're going by appealing to the fact that it's on the right side of the street. It depends on the fact that you're negating the left-hand side in order for it to be more specific. You're proceeding by negating more and more things until you indicate only the location that you're trying to direct them to. It's like that game of Guess Who, right? I'm sure most of us 90s kids are familiar with Guess Who. You have a picture of someone, and your opponent has a picture of someone, and you're trying to guess which face they have out of a lineup of faces. And the way the game proceeds is that you guess at which qualities the person has as a means of excluding or negating as many possible people as you can until you narrow down the selection, hopefully only to one possible answer, before your opponent can. That's the way that our definitions or our categories used to navigate existence proceed by negation, and the way that negation both separates and connects. It separates because it does differentiate one from the other, like the left side of the street and the right side, but it connects them. It inevitably connects the right side of the street to the left when you use that as a description. And that could be extended to almost everything, such that one could say that everything in the entire world has to be connected with everything else, that this is the final consequence of seeing every quality a thing has as being relational. In the end, reality is conceived as a sort of totality of all of these relationships. It's through this understanding of arriving at truth by the mode of negation that Hegel comes to the assertion that becoming is a reflection of being. This is a means of overcoming the difference between, for example, Heraclitus, who sees the reality as change, and becoming as the ultimate truth, and Parmenides, who sees reality as an unchanging eternity, and being as the ultimate truth. Becoming for Hegel is what he calls the unity of identity and non-identity. This is one of those phrases that when you read it aloud might make you sound insane to yourself. But we can notice the formula, once again, of x does not equal x, or rather, x also equals not x, that characterizes Hegel's thought. And there are some interesting advantages to this view, some of which we might even say were picked up by Nietzsche in some form or another. The reason why becoming is the unity of identity and non-identity is because this unity of sameness and difference, we might call it, reflects the reality of being. What this means is that existence, as with all other things, must be defined by a negative relationship with non-being. We can only have a notion of something in reference to nothing. We only have a notion of the presence of a thing if we can also imagine its absence, or if we can hold up the possibility of its absence against the sensation of its presence. That's what it means to truly know something is present, not just to perceive the sensation of its presence, but to truly know that it is present. This knowing comes with the self-awareness that its presence can only be asserted by excluding its absence, meaning that absence is connected to the idea of presence, just as it is also, by that same token, separated from it. The reason why this negative character of being is revealed in becoming is because of the very fact that phenomena are impermanent, changing, temporal. That's to say, things come into being and nevertheless negate themselves by changing. We would consider the flowing river of Heraclitus. One never steps into the same waters twice because the water exists in a state of flow, and all of the water that you experience upon the second time you enter the river is entirely new water. The river, we might say, is negating itself at every moment because it's ever in this state of flow. And yet the river is defined by this state of flow. If the river didn't flow, if it always held still, it wouldn't be a river. So too with all phenomenal things. They come into being, but they don't exist in a static mode of existence, but a dynamic one. And so this is how the process of negation for Hegel is constitutive. Becoming reflects being, because to define being depends on non-being. Being in itself, which would be being completely separate and unrelated to non-being, again, this would just be a mere abstraction, a one-sided portrait of reality. Because in actual reality, like with the river, the various phenomena exist in a constant negation of themselves. The thing as it is in one moment is constantly negating its own existence as it becomes the thing in the next moment, and then in the following moment after that, and so on and so forth. And without this negation, the phenomenal world would not be what it is, just as a river that didn't flow would not be a river. A human being that remained exactly the same and didn't age or grow wouldn't be a human being. A star that didn't undergo this process of fission wouldn't really be a star, and so on and so forth. This is, as best as I can manage it, the unity of identity and difference, or the unity of difference and sameness, or the identity of identity in difference. I understand there's various ways to translate it. This is how the Hegelian dialectic proceeds, via negation. And I should point out there's also the term sublation. I've talked about this term before, aufheben, very important word for Hegel. It means, there's no equivalent in English, but it means to cancel, to lift up, and to maintain, all at the same time. We're going to be using the term negation for our purposes here, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that I think it more forcefully poses a challenge to that Aristotelian construction of being that we might consciously or unconsciously carry around with us. And furthermore, since we're diving into Hegel as a sort of prelude to Deleuze, it's this negative establishment of being. It's that aspect of sublation that Deleuze seems to target. So I think it's just easier to use the term negation for our purposes in this episode. But understand there's various ways to translate all of this. It's very difficult to translate many of the concepts in Hegel. And so the Hegelian dialectic proceeds via negation in order to make conscious that which is, to know or to understand, not just to sense or perceive, the reality. It's the raising of our consciousness to perceive the absolute truth, in some sense. The Master-Slave Dialectic is the first step in raising our consciousness to the truth of self-consciousness. Consciousness, for Hegel, goes beyond mere perception or sensation. As we might imagine, many animals have mere perception and sensation, but consciousness is knowledge of oneself, knowledge that returns to itself as the object of knowledge. Now, before we get into the Master and Slave Dialectic, there's yet another element I'd like to talk about, which is key to understanding this process, and it concerns Hegel's notion of desire. Now, of course, desire, too, has a negating aspect. We could begin by describing life as this very force of desire. As living things, we desire things in the external world. We perceive objects or things external to ourselves that we desire. And how do we fulfill this desire? By negating these things. What this means, to put it into concrete terms, I think is very easy to understand when we put it in terms of hunger or thirst. The basic animal desire is finding food or water. And what do you do when you find it? You eat it, you drink it, negating the thing by destroying it, but in the process taking it into yourself, making it a part of yourself. This is to make that which is external dependent upon you, or to, Hegel calls this enjoying its dependent aspect. By overcoming that in the object, which has to be worked upon, which does not yield itself up to you easily, which is its independent aspect, you get to enjoy its dependent aspect. If we were to expand this understanding of desire to other types of human needs, we could say, for example, that in my desire for shelter, I take a tree and chop it down, work the wood into boards, and reshape the tree into a house. So I take this object, and in the act of creating something new, bringing that which I desire into being, I've destroyed the thing that it was, the tree. When Hegel says the independent aspect of the tree resists me, this means that the tree does not turn itself into a house upon my command. It wants to remain the distinct force that it is as a tree. The tree becomes a dependent object, one which is dependent upon me, once I negate its independence, make it into an instrument of my own will. I think this is all pretty easy to grasp. The key point is this negating aspect that moves within desire. To take the object, use it for my own purposes to satisfy me, and thus in the act, turning it into something else. And we could see how your every desire could be reinterpreted as a will to transform the world, to bring into being what was not there before, but in that same act, destroy what existed previously. And so now we come to the Master-Slave Dialectic, finally. And this is part of Hegel's monumental work, Phenomenology of Spirit. That name might be somewhat mystifying if you hear it out of context, but having gone over everything that we have, one can probably work out what the title more or less means. Phenomenology, the study of phenomena, the world of appearances, reclaiming the world of appearances as the world in which truth is found, and phenomenology of what? Of spirit. Geist, the intellect or consciousness of mankind, a phenomenological understanding of the human mind. That's Hegel's purpose here, and the Master-Slave Dialectic appears in the section on history. Now, as most will point out when discussing this section, the Master-Slave Dialectic is not history. It's not intended to signify a literal historical event. There's no single happening in the course of history to which Hegel is referring. Rather, we could say that this is the psychic process that Hegel believes plays out in the background of human thought over a period of long generations or epochs. We could say that Hegel's master and slave in this passage are characters in a type of psychological myth, meant to elucidate the process by which self-consciousness comes into being. So this doesn't refer to the historical first master who took the first slave in the year 4085 BC or something like that. This is Hegel's attempt at showing how the mind comes to know itself. And importantly, it's not an individual incident. It's not some particular instance where the mind comes to know itself. Rather, as Hegel says, to merely sense or perceive something is not to know it, to understand it. To know it is to bring knowledge of it into your consciousness, and this is the route by which the mind understands itself. So he's not talking about an individual instance of the master-slave dialectic. In some sense, we could say the master-slave dialectic is still happening today. It's not something that was ever definitively initiated, nor can we say it ever really reaches completion, at least until the so-called end of history. So the way that this begins is that in the normal course of pursuing our desires, utilizing the logic that Hegel has asserted up until this point, we search for things to negate. These are the objects of our desire, and by negating them, this proves your mastery over them, in some sense. We could interpret the pursuit of human desires as a manifestation of a search for freedom, because one is freed from a desire in the act of negating that desire. Another way of phrasing this, this understanding of how desire operates, is that one dominates the external world, the objects you find around you, all of that which is other to you, external to you, in order to demonstrate that this external world has no power over you, that you are not dependent on the external world, but independent of it, that this represents freedom in the substantial sense. In this process of negating that which is not yourself, the possibility of self-consciousness emerges into being. One attains a conception of being, the self-knowledge that I am a distinct force in the world. I am a force that is not the other forces. The external world around me is not me. This might be called a rudimentary form of self-consciousness. By overcoming these competing forces in the world, one knows oneself as an independent being. Of course, in the Hegelian dialectic, the sense of independence is thereby established through dependence, through the relation of oneself to the rest of the world. By dominating that which is external to oneself, one comes to know oneself as a masterful being. By negating that which is not you, you define yourself. But that means that you need this relationship in order to have this knowledge of self-consciousness. It depends on that negation, meaning that in truth, you're not independent. That's sort of the quandary here. Hegel writes, quote, "Self-consciousness is primarily simple existence for self, self-identity by exclusion of every other from itself. It takes its essential nature and absolute object to be ego. And in this immediacy, in this bare fact of its self-existence, it is individual. That which for it is other stands as unessential object, as object with the impress and character of negation." End quote. So this is the rudimentary kind of self-consciousness, but as we already hinted, Hegel immediately brings in a kind of negation of this rudimentary sense of self-consciousness. And this occurs in the form of the encounter with another self-consciousness. Neither self-consciousness is, at this point, conscious of the other consciousness. Even in trying to explain Hegel and simplify his language, you end up using tortured language. But in any case, this is part of why it's essential not to consider Hegel's account as a historical event, because it's doubtful that at any point there were human beings who didn't consider, for example, their family members or offspring to be self-conscious and had to discover this fact. Rather, it may be the case that human beings might have always intuited this assertion of the self-consciousness of others and acted as though it were true. But again, Hegel's not just interested in our intuition. He believes this is how we actually come to know this and understand this. But I guess the more important point I'm trying to make is that what Hegel's doing here is writing for our benefit. He's dramatizing the stages by which we would not merely intuit that the self-consciousness of another is true, but come to know it. It's not a literal historical event. The Master-Slave Dialectic, therefore, is initiated when this self-consciousness encounters another self-consciousness, and they engage in the same struggle that life always engages in to negate the other as a means of proving their own being. And so these two self-consciousnesses meet. They're going around trying to negate which is other to themselves, and naturally they try to negate one another. Hegel writes, quote, "The other is also a self-consciousness. An individual makes its appearance in antithesis to an individual. Appearing thus in their immediacy, they are for each other in the manner of ordinary objects. They are independent individual forms, modes of consciousness that have not risen above the bare level of life, for the existent object here has been determined as life. They are, moreover, forms of consciousness which have not yet accomplished for one another the process of absolute abstraction, of uprooting all immediate existence, and of being merely the bare negative fact of self-identical consciousness, or in other words, have not yet revealed themselves to each other as existing purely for themselves, i.e. as self-consciousness. Each is indeed certain of its own self, but not of the other, and hence its own certainty of itself is still without truth." End quote. And that last sentence raises a critical aspect of the master-slave dialectic, that in this growing awareness of self-consciousness, there is a sense in which one cannot be certain of this identity as a self-conscious being unless this is recognized by another self-conscious being. We need a point of comparison, something by which to contrast ourselves and, by this token, know ourselves. And remember, again, with Hegel's entire approach to philosophy, what is it that actually exists? What is it that is actually being, that actually has being? Forces, effects, sensations, things which have to be recognized by something else. Being is relational, right? And so if one only knows their own consciousness, it's unclear how they would have a sense of what consciousness itself is. They look out into the world and never encounter another self, never encounter this consciousness in the form of something external, something that is quote-unquote like me, but not me, right? So in their current perception, in this rudimentary form of self-consciousness, it's all just unknowing objects. How does one raise into being the possibility of another consciousness? And Hegel's assertion is that it comes into being in the course of this struggle. This struggle is part of that desire for freedom, to see one's self-consciousness as defined by its negation of the external world, in order to negate that which is external and thus have mastery over it. Hegel's assertion is that to truly know this, to truly know oneself, to exist as a being for itself, a consciousness with its own will, one must know that it is unimpeded even by death or by the fear of death, by mortal danger. The masterful soul, the truly free soul, is even unafraid of death. So the willingness to engage in a life or death struggle is essential because it's a declaration of one's freedom in some sense. One is not bound, as a mere unthinking animal is, by the fear of death. Hegel writes, quote, "The presentation of itself, however, as pure abstraction of self-consciousness, consists in showing itself as a pure negation of its objective form, or in showing that it is fettered to no determinate existence, that it is not bound at all by the particularity everywhere characteristic of existence as such, and is not tied up with life. The process of bringing all this out involves a twofold action: action on the part of the other and action on the part of itself. Insofar as it is the other's action, each aims at the destruction and death of the other. But in this, there is implicated also the second kind of action, self-activity. For the former implies that it risks its own life. The relation of both self-consciousnesses is in this way so constituted that they prove themselves and each other through a life and death struggle. They must enter into this struggle, for they must bring their certainty of themselves, the certainty of being for themselves, to the level of objective truth, and make this a fact both in the case of the other and in their own case as well. And it is solely by risking life that freedom is obtained. Only thus is it tried and proved that the essential nature of self-consciousness is not bare existence, is not the merely immediate form in which it at first makes its appearance, is not its mere absorption in the expanse of life. End quote. And further down, Hegel continues, quote, "In the same way, each must aim at the death of the other, as it risks its own life thereby. For that other is to it of no more worth than itself. The other's reality is presented to the former as an external other, as outside itself. It must cancel that externality. The other is a purely existent consciousness and entangled in manifold ways. It must view its otherness as pure existence for itself or as absolute negation." End quote. So you have two beings, both assured of their own self-consciousness through the negating process of being masterful over the world. As they have done in so many struggles with non-human beings, with prey, with other predators even, they enter into a struggle with one another. And we might imagine that several outcomes might occur from such a struggle. In a battle to the death, one might kill the other. Or, as often happens in such struggles between, the males within a species, if they both fight too hard without relenting, both might die of their injuries. Or, fearing this outcome, both might relent and flee. Hegel is not saying that any one outcome is necessarily going to happen, but that in the long course of history, what did happen, and what was bound to happen, with enough iterations of this struggle, is that one individual wins the fight and the other relents. They submit to the winning individual out of their fear of death. This is the historically significant outcome for Hegel, when one party yields to the other, clinging to their life, choosing to hold on to life rather than engage in this pursuit of desire to master the world, attain freedom even from the fear of death. They realize that they cannot be free if they're dead, and so they submit, and the losing party becomes the slave, or bondsman, and the winning party becomes the master, or the lord. Quote, "In this experience, self-consciousness becomes aware that life is as essential to it as pure self-consciousness. In immediate self-consciousness, the simple ego is absolute object, which, however, is for us, or in itself, absolute mediation, and has as its essential moment substantial and solid independence. The dissolution of that simple unity is the result of the first experience. Through this, there is posited a pure self-consciousness, a consciousness which is not purely for itself, but for another, i.e., as an existent consciousness in the form and shape of thinghood. Both moments are essential, since, in the first instance, they are unlike and opposed, and the reflection into unity has not come into light. They stand as two opposed forms or modes of consciousness. The one is independent, and its essential nature is to be for itself. The other is dependent, and its essence is life or existence for another. The former is the master or lord, the latter the bondsman or slave." End quote. So what has happened is that the master apparently has attained the goal that he sought out to achieve: to know himself as a being for himself through the act of mastering the world, that is to say, negating the objects of his desire. He has done this with a slave, and now feels himself a pure self-consciousness, consciousness which exists for itself. He has a sense of independence. This comes from the sense of his power. Meanwhile, the slave is made into one who exists for another. His life and his labor, from this point forth, is used to produce things and work on behalf of the master, for the master. So in the immediate aftermath of this struggle, the master is assured of his mastery by placing the slave into a state of subjection. This is within the modus operandi by which this sense of mastery or freedom has been achieved before, in every other sense, until it comes up against another self-consciousness. The slave as he was is negated, his free state beforehand exists no longer, and now he's been transformed into an object for the use of the master. The slave becomes property, dependent on the master for his very life. Dependency here meaning he's used at the master's leisure, and if the master decided to kill him, he could. He's at his mercy. By yielding, the slave or the bondsman gives into his fear of death, and that's an important part of the recognition that occurs in the process of the Master-Slave Dialectic, the recognition of mortality. And it's worth saying this is one of the ways in which Hegel thinks the slave actually comes out better out of the master and slave dialectic than the master does. He gets the better end of the deal, that in the long run, given the bird's eye view, the grand historical perspective, the master appears to be master at the outset, but is eventually revealed to be only superficially so. He negates his own masterfulness over the course of this dialectic. And meanwhile, the slave becomes the driving force of history. He's the active one in the creation of self-consciousness. The slave recognizes life as essential to freedom and exists in a state of being for others, which is actually a higher phase in the process of understanding what self-consciousness is, in Hegel's view, than the phase that the master is at, whose conception of self-consciousness is allowed to remain in this simple form of being for myself. I'm the center of everything. I'm an independent consciousness dominating the world that's external to me. Hegel writes, quote, "For this consciousness was not in peril and fear for this element or that, nor for this or that moment of time. It was afraid for its entire being. It felt the fear of death, the sovereign master. It has been, in that experience, melted to its inmost soul, has trembled throughout its every fiber, and all that was fixed and steadfast has quaked within it. This complete perturbation of its entire substance, this absolute dissolution of all its stability into fluent continuity, is, however, the simple ultimate nature of self-consciousness, absolute negativity, pure self-referent existence, which consequently is involved in this type of consciousness. This moment of pure self-existence is moreover a fact for it, and the master, it finds this as its object. Further, this bondsman's consciousness is not only this total dissolution in a general way. In serving and toiling, the bondsman actually carries this out. By serving, he cancels in every particular aspect his dependence on and attachment to natural existence, and by his work removes this existence away." End quote. Hegel's meaning here is that by laboring for the master, the slave has to negate his own animal nature, the nature of just pursuing his desires in a simple, direct way, wherever they might arise. The master never gets out of this state, but the slave does. He's shaken by the master into a state of mortal fear, which brings his own mortality into his consciousness and the value of life into his consciousness. And in order to hold on to life, he learns he has to negate his immediate desires or impulses. And his servitude reinforces this. This becomes his life. The slave's wants and desires are no longer important. He suppresses them and instead works on behalf of the master. This new state of the slave as dependent on the master soon reveals itself as more complex, as the master, through this process, comes to depend on the slave. This is true in a physical sense, insofar as the slave is the one who's put to work in the independent world. He engages with the objects in their independent aspect, the aspect of the object that fights you, that resists you, that defines itself by defending itself from being negated by other things, such that the slave has to now go work by chopping down the tree, doing the work, the labor that this requires to negate the tree and transform it into a house. And the master has nothing to do with this process. He just enjoys the dependent aspect. His desire directs the slave's labor, but the master does not himself labor. Quote, "The bondsman, being a self-consciousness in the broad sense, also takes up a negative attitude to things and cancels them. But the thing is, at the same time, independent for him, and in consequence, he cannot, with all his negating, get so far as to annihilate it outright and be done with it. That is to say, he merely works on it. To the master, on the other hand, by means of this mediating process, belongs the immediate relation in the sense of the pure negation of it. In other words, he gets the enjoyment. What mere desire did not attain, he now succeeds in attaining, to have done with the thing, and find satisfaction in enjoyment. Desire alone did not get the length of this because of the independence of the thing. The master, however, who has interposed the bondsman between it and himself, thereby relates himself merely to the dependence of the thing, and enjoys it without qualification and without reserve. The aspect of its independence he leaves to the bondsman, who labors upon it." End quote. So, the slave works in the independent world of objects, but he never gets to enjoy the dependent aspect. And notice the way Hegel puts this, that the master gets to enjoy the dependent aspect, but he mediates his relationship to the objects through the slave. He's now the one who does the work. He's interposed between the master and the external world. And so what happens then is that the master becomes a passive figure, a passive force in the relationship between the two. His sense of mastery, as we said, negates itself, both in the material sense, when it comes to the master's passivity and literal reliance on the bondsman, which we can see in actual specific historical instantiations. This happened many times, but also in the subjective sense, in the sense of Hegel's phenomenology of mind. The key point here is that the relationship that the slave and master have to the objective world, once this power relation is established between them, shapes their relationship to the subjective world too. Hegel writes, quote, "In all this, the unessential consciousness is, for the master, the object which embodies the truth of his certainty of himself. But it is evident that this object does not correspond to its notion. For just where the master has effectively achieved lordship, he really finds that something has come about quite different from an independent consciousness. It is not an independent, but rather a dependent consciousness that he has achieved. He is thus not assured of self-existence as his truth. He finds that his truth is rather the unessential consciousness and the fortuitous unessential action of that consciousness." End quote. So this dependency, again, it doesn't just exist in the objective sense, but in the subjective. The slave gives the master recognition of the master's self-consciousness. But this means that the master's self-consciousness is now mediated through the slave, just as the labor, the master's desire, the way that he brings to bear force in the world is mediated through the slave. This recognition or discovery is that the master's self-consciousness is affirmed by seeing another self-consciousness acknowledge or recognize the master as this distinct dominating force in the world. But in terms of the master's true consciousness, Hegel says that since the slave is essential for the master to have this self-recognition, it makes his own consciousness the unessential form of consciousness. Now, conversely, the slave is not treated as a self-consciousness by the master, but as an instrument, as an object of desire to negate, and then as this dependent aspect or function of the master's desires, right? The slave is thereby not given recognition, which is what Hegel thinks is the true object of human desire, as a self-conscious being. And so the relationship is inherently unsatisfactory, and it's unsatisfactory for both parties involved. And so, like the consciousness of the masters, which negates itself, becomes the inverse of what it was at the outset, this drives the slave's consciousness to do the same. Hegel writes, quote, The truth of the independent consciousness is, accordingly, the consciousness of the bondsman. This doubtless appears in the first instance outside itself, and not as the truth of self-consciousness. But just as lordship showed its essential nature to be the reverse of what it wants to be, so too bondage will, when completed, pass into the opposite of what it immediately is. Being a consciousness repressed within itself, it will enter into itself and change round into real and true independence." End quote. So again, by analogy, the slave's engagement with the objects of the world places him into a position or sense of mastery over the world. He becomes an expert at all of the techniques he has to learn in order to work on behalf of the master. But that mastery over the world is the exact same thing that the master was seeking, and what he now finds he doesn't have. But that's what the slave realizes over the course of his bondage. And through the fear of death instilled into him, he gains an awareness of himself, as Hegel says, in the sense that he exists in his own right and for his own account. Hegel writes, quote, "Shaping or forming the object has not only the positive significance that the bondsman becomes thereby aware of himself as factually and objectively self-existent, this type of consciousness also has a negative import, in contrast with its moment, the element of fear. For in shaping the thing, it only becomes aware of its own proper negativity, existence on its own account, as an object, through the fact that it cancels the actual form confronting it. But this objective negative element is precisely alien external reality, before which it trembled. Now, however, it destroys this extraneous alien negative, affirms and sets itself up as a negative in the element of permanence, and thereby becomes for itself a self-existent being. In the master, the bondsman feels self-existence to be something external, an objective fact. In fear, self-existence is present within himself. In fashioning the thing, self-existence comes to be felt explicitly as his own proper being, and he attains the consciousness that he himself exists in its own right and on its own account." End quote. And the German is an und für sich. Now, as we've said, the slave's self-consciousness is not respected or recognized by the master. Within himself, the slave has fashioned a truly independent self-consciousness. He has arrived here dialectically by existing as a being that exists solely for another, but all of these elements that Hegel talks about in the passage we just read create the actual truth, the actual experience, as being the essential consciousness, the independent consciousness. The master, meanwhile, loses his sense of being an independent self-consciousness and only exists through the other, only able to feel his power by ordering the slave around, through the slave's servitude to him. The relationship becomes indispensable to the master, and the slave, meanwhile, grows to possess that consciousness of an independent essential being. Now, finally, the master also has a deep dissatisfaction or a sense of incompleteness in this relationship, because by negating the self-consciousness of the slave, he's not truly getting the self-recognition that he desires. Because what the self-consciousness truly needs in order to know itself is to be recognized by the other. The desire for me to be understood by you as self-conscious in the same way that you are self-conscious. And so this need for the recognition of our self-consciousness has been discovered over the course of this dialectic. So to trace the argument up to this point, we begin with a negation of a kind of simple, one-sided self-consciousness. I'm conscious, I'm master of everything, I negate everything else to prove that I'm something. This is the rudimentary form of self-consciousness. And it's only upon the negation of that rudimentary form that we move on to the new stage of the dialectic, that self-consciousness, true self-consciousness, is a social consciousness. And so, in pursuing our natural desires, we find that we are truly pursuing self-consciousness. And in pursuing self-consciousness, we find that we're actually pursuing social consciousness. That to pursue ourselves is to pursue relatedness to others. To know our own mind requires that we know another mind, and a mind that in turn knows us. And so accordingly, that what we really want, even the master, or especially the master, is not to be acknowledged by a mere object or by something beneath ourselves or that we perceive as beneath ourselves, because that isn't true recognition. What we want is the recognition of ourselves by an equal, by another self-consciousness that we fully recognize as self-conscious. I don't simply want to be recognized by someone that I consider as less than self-conscious. By depriving the slave of this self-consciousness in his own perception of him, the master finds that he doesn't have a satisfactory recognition of his own self-consciousness through the slave. But the slave is further along in the dialectic, as we've mentioned, and Hegel says he becomes this driving force of history because he's been placed into what Hegel calls this active position in the dialectic. By becoming this mediating force between the master and the objective world, the slave gains an awareness or begins to recognize himself in contrast with the desires and mind of the master, quote, precisely in labor, where there seem to be merely some outsider's mind and ideas involved, the bondsman becomes aware, through this rediscovery of himself by himself, of having and being a mind of his own, end quote. So I want to note, we're still not at the point of mutual recognition, but the foundation has been laid by which Hegel will go on to argue that history itself proceeds forward as a struggle for this mutual recognition, that we don't fully have it, and we won't fully have it until the end of history. And that's because both master and slave ultimately seek that mutual recognition. Both are, unbeknownst to themselves, the same type of consciousness, which can only know itself through another. And this mutual recognition is to become the goal of all history for Hegel. And the master-slave relationship is that first definite social relationship which begins the process of history, or the history of consciousness, we might say, the end of which is total mutual recognition. And this occurs in the state at the end of history. This concept of the state at the end of history is worth talking about, however, briefly, but simply so that we might understand the master and slave dialectic is the beginning of this social process, which is the creation of social consciousness. But the state at the end of history is the ending. This is a social state of being in which every self-consciousness lives in the recognition of every other self-consciousness, in that recognition that they're all a being existing for itself, and thereby every self-consciousness can be assured of its own existence for itself through the recognition of other self-consciousnesses, mediated through them. And thus, in this state, the common humanity, the common dignity, worth, inner value of every person is recognized, apart from any considerations of race or nationality or anything incidental or contingent about you. That you are another human being, and I recognize the common divinity in you, if you will. And funnily enough, Hegel seemed to believe that the kingdom of Prussia may have approximated something like this state at the end of history. And I'm personally not enough of a Hegel scholar to be able to explain that to you. I suppose Hegel really liked the place that he was living in and liked to talk up the kingdom of Prussia. And so, while Hegel's argumentation is notoriously Byzantine, and while we could take issue with many of the claims he's made, if I might appeal to our intuitions for a moment and offer a steel man for all of you Nietzscheans who will be very quick to reject the importance that Hegel places in this idea of mutual recognition, we might consider the phenomenon of embarrassment. Why is it that we have a feeling of embarrassment when we do something which is ungraceful or inexpert or makes you look silly or incompetent or dumb? I mean, we should even consider the language we use. It made me look stupid. It made me look silly. What we're concerned with, based on that language, is how we're perceived by others, what they recognize in us. That there is a real forcefulness to the argument that much of our self-image is driven by the way we feel we are perceived. That, to use some contrived Hegelian language, how I perceive that you perceive me is a huge part of how I perceive myself. My self-perception, in some sense, is mediated through you, the other. And if that weren't true, then we wouldn't have a notion of what it means to be embarrassed. That is, to have the perception others hold of us somehow damaged, altered in some unfavorable way. If we were, all just strictly consciousnesses for ourselves, mediated through no one, then you would never get embarrassed. But the number of people who can claim to live this way are very few. Most of you do not live like Diogenes. I certainly don't. And most of us do seem to care about the way we're perceived by others. And so it becomes somewhat compelling when Hegel says, this is what we really want, to be recognized for our self-consciousness by others. And the affirmation of all self-consciousness by every other self-consciousness is the very thing that arises, the goal that emerges from the first step taken in the Master-Slave Dialectic. It emerges from that very sense of dissatisfaction that exists within that primitive form of power relation represented in the Master-Slave Dialectic, in which we have an inkling of this mutual recognition, but it doesn't truly take place. And so we might say it moves dialectically. The state of affairs begins over long generations to negate itself, because what we really desire is the mutual recognition, and therefore when we desire, we negate, right? And so we have to negate the state of affairs known as master and slave in order to bring something into being that more closely approximates the mutual recognition that is driving history through our desire for it. And inevitably we'll create something else that's not quite satisfactory, that doesn't quite fulfill that desire, and so then we will negate that, because every single state of affairs which comes into being negates itself. It's the flow of Heraclitus's river, right? And so from the historical perspective, the master-slave relationship becomes the feudal system. Then the feudal system becomes mercantile capitalism. And over these concrete historical changes, we reach the society we're in today, where we're no longer at this completely unsatisfactory state of affairs of the master and slave, but very few people would say we're at the state at the end of history, Francis Fukuyama excluded, right? Few would say that we've truly reached this point where everyone's self-consciousness is respected and recognized. I think it would be very few and far between to find somebody who would say that. But what I just described is a sort of material interpretation of dialectics, and that's exactly the way the Marxists interpret human history and the history of politics and economics. I want to look at one more excerpt to take it back to the realm of Geist from the material world, and just take a peek into the next section entitled The Unhappy Self-Consciousness, which I think is very important for understanding where Hegel's driving at with all this. Quote, "The repressed and subordinate type of consciousness becomes, in the formative activity of work, an object to itself, in the sense that the form given to the thing when shaped and molded is his object. He sees in the master at the same time self-existence as a real mode of consciousness. But the subservient consciousness as such finds these two moments fall apart, the moment of itself as an independent object and the moment of this object as a mode of consciousness, and so its own proper reality. Since, however, the form and self-existence are for us, or objectively in themselves, one and the same, and since in the notion of independent consciousness the inherent reality is consciousness, the phase of inherent existence, or thinghood, which received its shape and form through labor, is no other substance than consciousness. In this way we have a new attitude or mode of consciousness brought about, a type of consciousness which takes on the form of infinitude, or one whose essence consists in the unimpeded movement of consciousness." End quote. The reason why I wanted to read this, or one of the reasons, what Hegel means by that phrase in the middle, quote, "the form and the self-existence are for us, or objectively in themselves, one and the same," end quote, is that these two independent objects, these two independent individual beings, are nevertheless one and the same in that they are both consciousness. This is, once again, the unity of identity and non-identity, the recognition of an other which is not me and nevertheless like me. And when Hegel says, for us, or objectively in themselves, he means the objective truth is that both these beings are indeed independent self-consciousnesses. That what they are discovering, this mutual recognition that they yearn for, is true. So when he says for us, he means for us Hegelians, those who know the truth. We know that even though the master and slave don't realize it yet, what has begun is their first step to the awareness of the truth, which means a new mode of consciousness. And what he says about this new mode of consciousness is that it takes on the form of infinitude. And what this means isn't an infinite quantity of consciousness, or whatever that might mean, but that its essence consists in an unimpeded movement of consciousness, meaning the contemplation of consciousness gives rise to this dialectical movement that takes place within the realm of the mind, and so it represents this infinitely ascending self-awareness of the absolute truth of consciousness that can go on forever. There's no material limit placed on how far we can take this dialectical movement of the spirit in this quest for self-recognition. So this is the ever-deepening revelation of the truth of self-consciousness through the dialectic, which again for Hegel means through negation. The movement from this unhappy state of consciousness in which no one is satisfied to the happy consciousness found through mutual recognition. The passages that follow the Master-Slave Dialectic in the section on the unhappy consciousness, these sections cover Stoicism and skepticism. It's, the conceptions of the mind and the revelation of the absolute mind over the course of history. It would take us beyond the scope of the episode to go over all of these, but the point is, the project doesn't end here for Hegel, and it's unclear that it would ever end. But what we have in the Master-Slave Dialectic is the foundation, Hegel's understanding of how self-consciousness comes into being through these relationships. And thus the significance of these power relationships is part of a long process, a long arc of history, you could say, that bends toward freedom. This is, in some sense, Hegel's big idea, his grand narrative, if you will, and it is a beautiful idea. And next week, we're going to do our best to destroy that idea. I'm joking. That's putting it a little too harshly. That's all for this week on Hegel, everyone. I hope I've done at least a marginally okay job of explaining Hegel, who I must admit I struggled with a great deal. Although I will say, at several times his ideas did click with me. Even when I found myself in disagreement, I think I at least see on an intuitive level the insight, the aha moment, the moment of genius that Hegel experienced. I think I've picked up on the overall thrust of his project. But again, next week we're going to attack all this, as I've already told you, with Deleuze's work, Nietzsche and Philosophy, which begins with this construction of Nietzsche as the anti-Hegel. So tune in next week to find out why this is. I hope I didn't sound terribly insane to all of you while explaining the Hegelian dialectic, but either way, hopefully you'll join me next time. This is Keegan, signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.